South Korea, a country of shamans, are they people who worship spirits or a collective of fraudsters? Hello, dear listeners. Did you know this fact? South Korea is the only developed OECD country in the world where shamanism substantially influences daily life, politics, culture, and economy. This is not just a simple statistic. This is our reality. According to official statistics, there are about 100,000 shamans in our country, but it's actually estimated to exceed 300,000. What's even more surprising is that the annual revenue of the shamanic industry they create reaches a staggering 3 trillion won. This corresponds to 1/10 of our country's automobile export value, an enormous scale. But here's a question we must ask. Is this truly our nation's traditional culture? Or is it a massive fraud that deceives modern people? Is such a phenomenon normal for us living in the 21st century? In an era where we communicate with the entire world through smartphones and artificial intelligence has become part of daily life? What does it mean that drumming in ritual ceremonies to summon spirits still influences important decision-making in our society? To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, we show a dual nature of claiming to be a science and technology powerhouse while simultaneously depending on shamanism. Isn't this contradictory behavior, like receiving surgery in a cutting-edge hospital while simultaneously receiving shamanistic rituals? Through today's program, we will examine how shamanism affects our society and whether this is helpful or harmful to us. Furthermore, we will also consider what the proper solution to this problem might be. Chapter 1. The Roots of Shamanism, Ancient Beliefs and Shamanism of the Korean People. To understand the shamanic phenomena we are currently witnessing, we first need to examine their roots. Shamanism on the Korean peninsula didn't begin yesterday. From the Gojoseon period through Buyo and the Three Hans, our ancestors established priest classes such as Cheongun or shamans, and offered sacrifices to heaven. Goguryeo Dongmengje, Buyo's Yongo, and Silla's Hansansa were all extensions of this shamanic tradition. However, what's important here is that there are fundamental differences between ancient shamanism and current shamanism. Ancient rituals were public ceremonies for the safety and prosperity of the entire community. In contrast, current shamanism mostly takes on the character of private transactions to fulfill individual desires. The tradition of female shamans particularly developed in earnest after the Goryeo period, when it began to change into complex and commercial forms under the influence of Buddhism and Confucianism. What we should note here is that shamanism has constantly changed its appearance according to the times. This means that shamanism is not a religion with fixed doctrines or systems, but rather a flexible belief system that transforms according to temporal needs. However, this very point is also the biggest problem with modern shamanism. Because there are no clear doctrines or ethical standards, anything can be justified in the name of shamanism, which can ultimately become a breeding ground for fraud and exploitation. If ancient shamanism served social functions for community order and stability, we need to seriously consider whether modern shamanism is performing dysfunctions that exploit individuals and throw society into chaos. Chapter 2. The Japanese colonial period and the duality of shamanism, between prohibition and utilization. The Japanese colonial period was a very important turning point in Korean shamanic history. In 1915, the Japanese government general issued a shamanism prohibition order, but paradoxically, during this period, shamanism developed into more cunning and secretive forms. Japan superficially defined shamanism as superstition and prohibited it, but actually used shamans as intelligence networks and tools for regional control. This shows the dual character of shamanism. In particular, Japan mixed their Taoism and emperor system with Korean shamanism, using it as a tool for colonial assimilation policy. In this process, Korean shamanism lost its original purity and became a mixture blended with foreign ideologies. To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, from this time, shamanism developed a habit of colluding with power. Shamans, for survival, sometimes resisted and sometimes cooperated, forming close relationships with political power. This historical experience remains a characteristic of Korean shamanism to this day. The roots of phenomena where shamans stay close to politicians and try to influence political decisions were formed during this period. Also, during this period, shamanism showed tendencies to become more mystified and commercialized because it was prohibited. Because it couldn't be done openly, it became more expensive and secretive services, which became the prototype of current high-cost ritual culture. Through this history, we can know that shamanism is not simply an ethnic tradition, but has instrumental characteristics that are transformed and utilized according to political situations. This provides important implications for how we should view shamanism currently. Chapter 3: Post-Liberation Survival Strategies of Shamanism, Democratization, Industrialization, and Media. After liberation, shamanism faced new challenges. As Western civilization and scientific thinking spread, shamanism's place became narrower, but shamans showed remarkable adaptability. In the 1960s and 70s, during the Park Chung-hee government's developmental dictatorship period, shamanism not only survived, but actually penetrated the center of power. It was an open secret that President Park Chung-hee himself consulted with shamans. In the 1980s, shamanism began to be packaged as romantic and mysterious through television dramas and various media. This was the most cunning of shamanism's survival strategies. Instead of directly presenting shamanism as religion or faith, it approached the public in the form of culture and entertainment. During this period, shamans evaded legal regulations by disguising themselves as self-employed, counselors, or religious figures. They operated under names like fortune-telling, physiognomy, and date selection, which became the foundation of the current shamanic industry structure. However, the most clearly revealed collusion between shamanism and political power was during the Park Geun-hye government's Choi Soon-sil scandal. The fact that shamanic beliefs were at the center of state affairs. Manipulation was a great shock to our society. To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, this incident showed that shamanism is not simply a matter of individual faith, but a problem that can pose dangers to the entire state and society. Having a country's president run state affairs according to a shaman's words is nothing less than shaking the foundations of democracy. Even now, the close relationship between politicians and shamans continues, acting as a factor that hinders rational decision-making in our society. Chapter 4: Superstition or Cultural Heritage. The state's dual attitude. Currently, our country shows very contradictory attitudes toward shamanism. On one hand, it says superstitions should be eradicated, while on the other hand, it designates and protects them as intangible cultural properties. In the 1970s, they conducted campaigns to eradicate decadent superstitions and suppressed shamanism, but from the 1980s, they began protecting shamanism as cultural heritage through intangible cultural property designation. Several shamanic events, including Gangneung Danojegut, were also registered as UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity. The government utilizes shamanic events as cultural arts and tourism resources, providing considerable budget support. However, at the same time, it neglects fraud damage caused by shamanism. This dual attitude is causing confusion among citizens. If the government protects shamanism as cultural heritage, it becomes difficult for ordinary citizens to judge whether shamanism is good or should be viewed with caution as superstition. To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, the government's such attitude is ultimately serving as an indulgence for the expansion of the shamanic industry. Under the packaging of cultural heritage, fraud and exploitation are being perpetrated. We must establish clear standards between cultural preservation and citizen protection. We should not neglect allowing modern people to suffer damage in the name of traditional culture. If it's truly cultural heritage, it should help people living in the present. However, we need to seriously examine whether current shamanism has degenerated into a means of exploiting and harming people. Chapter 5. The business model of shamanism, ritual costs, and fraud structure. Currently, Korea's shamanic industry has established very systematic and commercial business models. This means it has become a huge industry beyond simple religious activities. The cost of one typical ritual ranges from millions to tens of millions of won. This is an enormous amount equivalent to ordinary people's annual salaries. But this is not the end. Shamans have built systems to continuously receive money from customers through fortune-telling, divination, date selection, and talismans. Particularly recently, shamanic content through YouTube has surged. Shamans earning tens of millions of won monthly through star balloons, advertising revenue, and product sales are emerging. They essentially provide shamanic services online under the name of fortune consultation. The most problematic is threatening consultation. They bewitch people through fear marketing such as, "If you don't do this ritual, you'll die. Your child is in danger. Great disaster will befall your family." Looking at a case that occurred in Songpagu, Seoul in 2023, a famous shaman was accused of fraud for taking tens of billions of won from customers. However, such cases are just the tip of the iceberg. To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, the current shamanic industry is pure business, far from religion or traditional culture. The main purpose is to make money by exploiting customers' anxiety and desires, and whether it actually helps customers is completely unimportant. What's more serious is that such fraud structures are difficult to punish legally. Because they are protected under the name of religious freedom, it's very difficult for victims to receive relief. We must now clearly distinguish whether shamanism is religion or business. If it's business, it should be regulated by the same standards as other businesses. And if it's religion, it should take responsibility as a true religion. Chapter 6. Shamanism and political power. Shamans beside the president. The collusion between shamanism and political power in Korean political history is not a recent phenomenon. However, recently such collusion has appeared in more blatant and direct forms, and particularly in the Yoon Suk-yeol government. The aspect has reached an unprecedentedly serious level. The line from former President Park Geun-hye to Choi Tae-min and Choi Soon-sil vividly showed how shamanism could intervene in state affairs. The fact that shamanic beliefs were at the core of state affairs manipulation was a symbolic event showing the crisis of our democracy. However, people thought this was a thing of the past. But reality was different. Around President Yoon Suk-yeol and his wife, more shamans were positioned than during the Park Geun-hye government, and their influence was at an unimaginable level. First, let's examine the figure called Chung-gong. In the 2021 People Power Party presidential primary candidate debate, candidate Yoo Sung-min directly asked candidate Yoon Suk-yeol, "Did you meet with your wife?" "Yes." "This person calls himself the true Dharma, Master Cheong-gong. What do you call him?" "I call him teacher." This conversation was broadcast live nationwide. It was the moment when a presidential candidate publicly acknowledged his relationship with a shaman. But this was just the beginning. Next is Jeonjin Beopsa. The figure of a middle-aged man patting presidential candidate Yoon Suk-yeol's shoulder was captured by the media. This person was identified as an unofficial camp member and had previously served as an advisor at Kim Gun-hee's Cabana contents. What's more shocking is that it was revealed that this Gyeongjin Beopsa hung lanterns with Yoon Suk-yeol and Kim Gun-hee's names written on them at a bizarre ritual in 2018, where they skinned a live cow and displayed more than 10 pig carcasses. And Myung Tae-gyun. This figure, who calls himself a Jirisan hermit, reportedly called President Yoon a blind warrior and Kim Gun-hee a sitting sorceress. Currently imprisoned, Myung Tae-gyun advised Kim Gun-hee that you'll die if you enter the Blue House, and this is suspected to be the background that hastened the presidential office's relocation to Yongsan. In the 7-hour recording revealed by MBC in 2022, Kim Gun-hee's surprising statements were revealed. She said, "I'm a very spiritual person, and I like talking about what is life with hermits." What's more shocking was her statement, "I'm better than most shamans. I can read fortunes a bit, and in my view, we're going to the Blue House." This is interpreted as claiming she has spiritual abilities superior to shamans. The incident where President Yoon Suk-yeol wrote the character King on his palm and appeared on a 2021 presidential primary TV debate is symbolic. This was interpreted as a type of talisman commonly used in shamanism. The fact that a feng shui expert frequented the Ministry of National Defense during the Yongsan presidential office relocation process was belatedly revealed. Feng shui was involved in determining the location of state institutions. What's most surprising is that the East Sea oil field announcement and Cheongong's prophecy coincided. President Yoon announced on June 3, 2024, that there's a very high possibility that up to 14 billion barrels of oil and gas are buried. But Cheongong had said on his YouTube channel on May 16th, earlier than that, "Don't we think we won't become an oil-producing country? We will in the future." This country has a lot of gas and oil underground. Most shocking is the connection between the December 3rd martial law declaration and shamanism. When the declaration time, December 3rd, 10:30, is written in Chinese characters, the character for King, Wang, appears consecutively. Could this be mere coincidence? What's even more surprising is that No Sang-won, a retired military officer identified as the planner of martial law, was a shaman who ran a fortune-telling shop. A shaman was involved in a crucial decision that could determine the nation's fate. Foreign media are also paying attention to this situation. Reports that President Yoon and his wife like to seek advice from shamans are causing Korea's national prestige to fall to the ground. To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, in a situation where 21st century South Korea is confronting North Korea, which has nuclear weapons, having the nation's top leader make policy decisions based on shamans' advice could pose serious risks to national security. What if Cheongong or Gyeongjin Beopsa advised, "You should go to war with North Korea," or "You should break relations with China"? This is precisely the danger of shamanic politics. What's more problematic is that such relationships are not transparently disclosed. Citizens have the right to know by what standards their elected leaders make decisions. However, the current situation appears to be that shamans are serving as unofficial power brokers while secretly intervening in state affairs. The shamanic suspicions in the Yoon Suk-yeol government exceed the level of the Park Geun-hye government's Choi Soon-sil scandal. There were even reports that Choi Soon-sil herself said, "What I did was only 1/10 of Kim Gun-hee's." We must apply the principle of separation of religion and politics more strictly. While respecting politicians' personal faith, it must not influence public decision-making. Particularly, unverified shamans intervening in national policy is absolutely unacceptable. Chapter 7. Modern Transformation of Shamanism, AI Rituals, YouTube Shamans, Instagram Shamans. Modern shamanism is undergoing amazing transformations. It's evolving from traditional ritual sites into new forms suited to the digital age, particularly as shamanism colluded with political power in the Yoon Suk-yeol government. The pace of this change has accelerated further. There are currently over 10,000 shamanism-related channels on YouTube, with thousands of channels earning over 1 million won monthly. Particularly, the YouTube channel Jongbeop Era of the figure known as Cheonggong has hundreds of thousands of subscribers and has received more attention since his relationship with President Yoon Suk-yeol was revealed. Cheonggong said on his channel, "Don't we think we won't become an oil-producing country? We will in the future. This country has a lot of gas and oil underground, and surprisingly, President Yoon Suk-yeol announced the East Sea oil field a few weeks later. This was an unprecedented case where a shaman's prophecy coincided with a national policy announcement. Since the launch of the Yoon Suk-yeol government, shamanic content revealing political leanings has surged. They essentially deliver political messages under names like tarot, divination, and fortune-telling. Videos titled President Yoon Suk-yeol's 4 Pillars of Destiny and Kim Gun-hee's Fortune are pouring out with hundreds of thousands of views. What's more surprising is that cases of becoming learning shamans without traditional spirit possession processes are increasing. People are becoming shamans by learning shamanism through shamanic academies or online lectures. Some of these people are exaggerating their influence by showing off relationships with politicians. Online rituals, video rituals, and even AI talisman apps have appeared. Even AI services that read fortunes and tell fortunes have emerged. This shows how commercially and technologically shamanism can change. Particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, non-contact rituals surged, and in this process, many shamans adapted to digital platforms. Rituals through Zoom, fortune consultation through Kakao Talk, and free fortune telling through Instagram Live became commonplace. Young shamans are also actively working on SNS, like Instagram and TikTok. They're attracting young customers with sophisticated and modern images, breaking away from the heavy shamanic image of the past. Particularly, concepts like pretty shamans and healing shamans targeting women in their 20s and 30s are popular. Instead of traditional hanbok, they wear dresses or suits, and instead of shamanic rituals, they use Western terms like energy healing and chakra balancing. But the essence is the same. The purpose is to make money by exploiting customers' anxiety. And although packaged with young and pretty appearances, the content is no different from traditional shamanism. What's most concerning is shamanic marketing, combined with political power. Some shamans are attracting customers by boasting that they're close to the president or high-ranking politicians. Advertising phrases like hermit directly visited by the president and shaman recognized by the Blue House are being used openly. This can be seen as fraudulent marketing, exploiting the authority of political power. To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, this phenomenon shows that shamanism is not true religion or faith, but simply a product. If it were true religion, it wouldn't be something that could be learned and sold so easily. Also, the fact that AI can provide shamanic services itself reveals the falsity of shamanism, doesn't it? If it's something a computer program can do, can it really be called sacred? What's more serious is that shamans colluding with political power are bewitching ordinary citizens by showing off their political influence. This is an act that shakes the foundations of democracy. The phenomenon of young generations falling into such modern shamanism is very concerning. If even the digital native generation comes to depend on irrational beliefs, we must seriously consider what will happen to our society's future. Particularly, the phenomenon of shamans making political prophecies and packaging them as if they actually happen is very dangerous. This can make citizens depend on shamanic beliefs rather than rational judgment. Chapter 8. Victims' Testimonies. People who lost their homes to rituals. What most vividly shows the reality of shamanism is the testimonies of victims. Looking into the tragic reality hidden behind glamorous packaging, we can see how dangerous shamanism is, particularly as shamanism colluded with political power in the recent Yoon Suk-yeol government. The scale of damage is growing larger. Ms. Kim, a woman in her 40s, ended up buried in debt, despite paying 50 million won in ritual fees. Although she started with small amounts, the shaman continuously demanded more money, saying, "You need to do bigger rituals for your luck to improve." Eventually, she had to sell her house. Ms. Kim says, "At first I just went to see my fortune, but the shaman told scary stories saying, 'There's great misfortune in your family.' She said the family might die if I didn't do rituals. So I started out of fear, but once I started, there was no end." What's more serious is cases where even children are affected. A high school student testified that his family was ruined and he was abused because his mother became addicted to rituals. The mother embezzled even the child's education expenses to raise ritual fees, and when the child objected, she verbally abused him, saying, "The family is ruined because you're interfering with the rituals." Recently, damage cases from shamans connected to political power are also increasing. Some shamans are receiving high consultation fees by packaging themselves as hermits the president visits and shamans recognized by the Blue House. Mr. Park, a businessman in his 50s, says, "I received consultation after hearing that the figure called Cheonggong was close to President Yoon Suk-yeol. I believed more as rumors spread that he predicted the East Sea oil field but eventually suffered big losses in business investment. Particularly, fraud, using political prophecies as pretext, is increasing. Shamans targeting politicians and businessmen with temptations like, 'I'll tell you who will win the next presidential election,' and 'I'll tell you in advance how government policies will change,' are increasing. In the digital age, online shamanic damage is also surging. Many cases start with free consultation through YouTube or Instagram and end up receiving expensive rituals. Mr. Lee, an office worker in his 20s, says, "I commented on a YouTube video offering free tarot readings, but they privately messaged me saying, 'Great, danger is approaching you,' and recommended personal consultation. It started at about 50,000 won, but gradually demanded larger amounts, and eventually demanded up to 5 million won. Particularly since COVID-19, as online rituals increased, victims are surging. Shamans are emerging who take millions of won for conducting rituals via video calls. Even when such victims try to take legal action, it's very difficult in reality. Because shamanism is considered religion, they hit the wall of religious freedom. Also, victims themselves often find it difficult to admit they were deceived. For fraud charges under criminal law to apply, deceptive acts, victims' mistakes and property damage must be proven. But in shamanism cases, it's very difficult to prove deceptive acts due to the abstract concept of sacred power. Particularly for shamans connected to political power, because they use the authority of being close to the president, victims are more easily deceived. However, it's difficult to verify whether such relationships are true. And even if true, it often doesn't become a legal problem. Beyond individual damage, national-level damage is also serious. There's a risk of wrong policy decisions being made as political leaders depend on shamanism. In cases like the East Sea oil field announcement, if it was hastily announced influenced by a shaman's prophecy, but nothing actually comes out, it could deal a fatal blow to national credibility. There's also a risk that as shamans show off political influence, ordinary citizens will depend on shamanic prophecies rather than democratic procedures. This shakes the foundations of democracy. To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, the current legal system is designed favorably for shamans and unfavorably for victims. Perpetrators are protected by religious freedom, but victims receive no protection in reality. What's more problematic is that such damage cases are not disclosed, preventing others from avoiding the same damage. Victims are reluctant to publicize their experiences due to shame and regret, which results in allowing shamans to continue creating other victims. Particularly for shamans connected to political power, because of their authority and influence, victims find it even more difficult to speak out. There's a burden about accusing someone close to the president. Our society must now prepare systematic protection systems for shamanic victims. While religious freedom is important, protecting citizens' lives and property is more important. Particularly for shamans colluding with political power, we must apply stricter standards. There should be aggravated punishment for fraudulent acts exploiting public authority, and politicians should also transparently disclose their relationships with shamans. We must also establish specialized counseling institutions and legal support systems for shamanic victims. We must create an environment where victims can confidently seek help without shame. Chapter 9. Perspectives of Christianity, Buddhism, and Catholicism, Spiritual Discernment and Response. How do existing religions view shamanic phenomena? Through their perspectives, we can more clearly grasp the essence of shamanism. Protestantism defines shamanism as idolatry and demonic deception. Based on Exodus 23's commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," and Leviticus 19:31's, "Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them." They clearly reject shamanism. Catholicism takes the position that, while it conflicts with church teachings, it respects it as cultural heritage. That is, religiously, it cannot be accepted, but culturally, it's acknowledged. Buddhism shows the view that shamanism is merely folk belief, and mixing within temples is undesirable. While seeing it as different from original Buddhist doctrine, it takes a moderate position of not completely rejecting it. To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, don't the positions of existing religions indirectly prove that shamanism is not true religion? If it were true religion, other religions would recognize or respect it to some degree. But all religions show negative views toward shamanism. Particularly, Christianity's perspective is very clear. 1 Corinthians 10:20 states, "No, but the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God, and I do not want you to be participants with demons." This religious perspective can be seen not simply as religious prejudice, but as spiritual discernment of shamanism's essence. The fact that religions that have guided humanity for thousands of years all warn against shamanism must have good reasons. We can obtain criteria for judging whether shamanism truly helps humans or is actually harmful through such religious perspectives. Chapter 10. Where is South Korea going? The possibility of coexistence between shamanism and reason. Now we stand at a crossroads. Will we view shamanism only as culture, or will we consider it fraud? This choice is an important issue that will determine our society's future. The biggest problem we currently face is the ambiguity between freedom of faith and fraud distinction. Religious freedom guaranteed by the Constitution is a precious right, but this should not become an indulgence for fraud and exploitation. We need clear legal systems and social boundaries. If we recognize shamanism as religion, we must demand the same level of transparency and accountability as other religions. If we protect it as culture, it must be separated from commercial activities. To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, our society is currently too lenient toward shamanism. Continuing to depend on shamanism in the 21st century, when science and technology have developed, could negatively affect national competitiveness. Particularly, the phenomenon of young generations falling into shamanism is very concerning. If young people who will be future leaders depend on irrational beliefs, it could deal serious blows to our country's scientific and technological development and rational thinking ability. We must now cultivate citizens' critical thinking abilities through education and inform them of shamanism's falsity. At the same time, we must prepare institutional measures to prevent damage from shamanism. We must also cut off the close relationship between politicians and shamans. Public decision-making must be based on rational and scientific grounds, and we must eliminate any room for shamanic faith to intervene. While shamanism may not completely disappear, we must at least prevent the current forms of exploitation and fraud. This requires both individual citizens' awakening and society-wide efforts. Conclusion: a spiritual people or deluded citizens? So far, we have examined shamanic phenomena deeply rooted in Korean society from various angles. Particularly, the collusion between shamanism and political power revealed in the Yoon Suk-yeol government vividly showed how serious this problem has become. Does shamanism truly represent our people's spiritual identity? Or is it a tool that deceives and exploits us? Historically, shamanism is certainly our people's long tradition. However, not everything is good just because it's traditional. When times change, traditions must also change, and harmful things should rightfully be discarded. Current shamanism is closer to commercial business rather than traditional culture. Furthermore, as seen in the Yoon Suk-yeol government, it has reached a dangerous stage where it colludes with political power and even intervenes in national decision-making. The coincidence of Cheonggong's prophecy and the East Sea oil field announcement, Jeonjin Beopsa's suspected intervention in Shincheonji investigation, and Mayong Tae-gun's advice on Yongsan relocation all show that shamanism is substantially influencing state affairs beyond simple personal faith. Some people say shamanism provides comfort, but if the price of that comfort is tens of millions of won, and the result is greater anxiety and dependence, can that really be true comfort? Moreover, if it influences even the president's decision-making, this could become a national disaster beyond personal problems. The danger of shamanic politics revealed in the Yoon Suk-yeol government is of a different dimension. Kim Gun-hee saying, "I'm better than most shamans," while boasting of her spiritual abilities, and the president carving the character Wang on his palm and appearing on TV debates. These scenes are hard to believe as 21st century South Korean reality. What's more serious is the connection between martial law declaration and shamanism. The consecutive appearance of Wang characters in the declaration time, December 3rd, 10:30, and the fact that No Sang-won, identified as the martial law planner, was a shaman who ran a fortune-telling shop, show how dangerous a situation our democracy is in. As foreign media report that President Yoon and his wife like to seek advice from shamans, South Korea's national prestige is falling to the ground. This is not simply a matter of face. National credibility directly affects all fields of diplomacy, economy, and security. How many countries would want to conduct important negotiations or share cutting-edge technology with a country whose leader depends on shamanism? To add a somewhat cynical perspective here, we show a dual nature of boasting about being an IT powerhouse and science technology advanced country while simultaneously depending on shamanism. This is a phenomenon that makes us doubt our society's maturity. Particularly, the impact on young generations is serious. Can children who grow up seeing the President and First Lady depend on shamanism really do rational and scientific thinking? Shamanic content spreading through YouTube and SNS is leading young generations to irrational beliefs. Now, we must make a clear choice. We must establish clear standards to distinguish shamanism from fraud and prepare systems to protect victims. At the same time, we must cultivate citizens' critical thinking abilities through education and create a rational society. Above all, we must completely cut off the collusion between politics and shamanism. Politicians must transparently disclose their relationships with shamans, and we must prepare legal and institutional measures to prevent shamanic intervention in public decision-making. The problem of shamanism is not simply a matter of individual faith. This is a problem concerning the reason and rationality of our entire society, and a problem concerning the nation's future. The reality of shamanic politics, revealed in the Yoon Suk-yeol government, clearly showed that this problem can no longer be neglected. First, John 4:1 states, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God." We must have discernment and not blindly believe everything. Also, 1 Corinthians 14:33 states, "For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace." True faith brings order and peace, but false things bring confusion and destruction. The shamanic politics that occurred in the Yoon Suk-yeol government is a typical example of such confusion and destruction. Like 1 Thessalonians 5:21's, "Test all things, hold fast what is good." We must carefully judge everything and take only what is good. We must not tolerate harmful things in the name of tradition or religious freedom. Finally, I sincerely thank you for staying with us for a long time. I hope this content helps your correct judgment, and please subscribe to the channel, like, and share your thoughts in comments to discuss such important topics with more people. Let's work together so our society can move away from the darkness of shamanism toward a healthier and more rational direction. Particularly, I hope all citizens will take interest in cutting off the collusion between politics and shamanism and restoring true democracy. Thank you.